Welcome to this journey into the forgotten darkness of American history. I'm your guide through the shadows, and today we delve into one of the most disturbing family secrets ever unearthed in rural Ohio. Before we begin, I'd like to know where you are right now and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below telling me your location and the hour you're watching this. There's something uniquely unsettling about sharing these stories across different times and places, connecting us all through the darkness. This is the story of the Hightower family and what transpired within the walls of their isolated barn in 1897. But this isn't just another tale of rural tragedy. This is an account of systematic horror, hidden births, and forbidden acts that would remain concealed for decades, buried beneath the soil of Crawford County, Ohio. The year was 1897. The Victorian era was drawing to a close, and America stood on the precipice of a new century. While cities like New York and Chicago buzzed with electric lights and modern innovations, vast stretches of rural America remained trapped in an earlier, darker time. Crawford County, Ohio, was one such place. Nestled in the north-central region of the state, its landscape consisted of dense forests, isolated farmsteads, and communities so remote that neighbors could live miles apart, separated by walls of trees and silence. It was here, on a 200-acre property surrounded by woodland so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor, that the Hightower family maintained their farm. The family patriarch, Ezekiel Hightower, had inherited the land from his father in 1873 and had spent nearly a quarter-century transforming it into a self-sufficient fortress of isolation. Visitors were not welcomed. The family rarely attended church services in the nearby town of Bucyrus, appearing perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, always together, always silent. The centerpiece of the Hightower property was a massive red barn built in 1875 that stood like a sentinel at the heart of the farm. Local residents who occasionally glimpsed the structure from the main road described it as unusually large for a family farm, with strange architectural features, including unusually thick walls, small windows positioned high above ground level, and a peculiar absence of the typical farm sounds one would expect. No cattle lowing, no horses neighing, no chickens clucking in the yard. But in the autumn of 1897, something changed. Rumors began circulating through Crawford County, whispered in general stores and discussed in hushed tones after Sunday services. Several residents living on properties adjacent to the Hightower farm reported hearing sounds during the night. Not animal sounds, human sounds, specifically the unmistakable cries of women in labor, echoing from the direction of that massive red barn. Martha Caldwell, a farmer's wife whose property bordered the Hightower land to the east, would later testify to authorities that she heard these sounds on at least 4 separate occasions between September and November of 1897. Each time, the screams would begin after midnight and continue for hours, sometimes until dawn. Her husband, John Caldwell, confirmed her account, adding a disturbing detail. On 2 occasions, he claimed to have seen lamplight moving beneath the barn, as if there were rooms or passages underground. Yet no babies were ever seen, no birth. Announcements appeared in the local newspaper. No christenings were held at the Methodist Church in Bucyrus. The Hightower family continued their rare visits to town, saying nothing, purchasing supplies with cash, and vanishing back into their forest fortress. Then, on November 17, 1897, everything changed. Dr. Howard Pierce, a respected physician who had practiced medicine in Crawford County for 15 years, received an urgent summons to the Hightower farm. A rider arrived at his home in the early hours of the morning, delivering a handwritten note requesting his immediate presence for a complicated birth requiring medical intervention. Dr. Pierce gathered his medical bag and departed. He told his wife he would return before nightfall. 3 days later, when Dr. Pierce had not returned and had sent no word, his wife contacted the sheriff. A search party was organized, and what they discovered at the Hightower farm would haunt Crawford County for generations to come. But before we continue with what the sheriff found that day, I want to pause here and ask you, what do you think happened to Dr. Pierce? What could have been happening in that barn? Share your theories in the comments below. To understand the horror that unfolded at the Hightower farm, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. The 1890s in rural Ohio was a time of dramatic contrasts. While the nation's cities embraced industrialization and modernity, rural communities remained deeply traditional, often suspicious of outsiders, and fiercely protective of family privacy. Crawford County, established in 1820 and named after Colonel William Crawford, who was burned at the stake by Native Americans in 1782, had a population of approximately 35,000 in 1897. The county seat, Bucyrus, boasted a population of just over 6,000. Beyond the town limits, however, civilization thinned dramatically. Farmsteads were separated by miles of forest, connected only by dirt roads that became impassable during winter months and spring thaws. The Hightower family had deep roots in this soil. Ezekiel Hightower's grandfather, Josiah Hightower, had arrived in Crawford County in 1831, claiming 200 acres through a land grant. The family had lived on that same property for 3 generations by 1897. According to county records held in the Crawford County Historical Society, the Hightowers were known as peculiar but harmless in early documents. A notation in the 1870 census described them as religiously devout, keeping to themselves. Ezekiel Hightower, born in 1845, married Margaret Thornton in 1868. Margaret came from a family equally isolated, living 15 miles north in Wyandotte County. The marriage was arranged between the families, a common practice in communities where eligible partners were scarce. Together, Ezekiel and Margaret had 4 children who survived infancy: Thomas, born 1869, Elizabeth, born 1871, Samuel, born 1873, and Rebecca, born 1875. What made the Hightower family unusual, even by the standards of isolated rural families, was their extreme religious fervor, coupled with an almost pathological aversion to outside contact. A letter preserved in the archives of the Bucyrus Historical Museum, written in 1883 by Reverend William Chester of the Bucyrus Methodist Church, describes an encounter with Ezekiel Hightower that offers insight into the family's mindset. Reverend Chester wrote, "I visited the Hightower property with the intention of inviting the family to our Easter services. Mr. Hightower met me at the end of his lane, rifle in hand, and informed me in no uncertain terms that his family required no spiritual guidance from the corrupted churches of modern society. He spoke at length about maintaining purity, about keeping his family untainted by the sins of the outside world. His interpretation of Scripture was unlike any I had encountered in 30 years of ministry. When I attempted to reason with him, he simply turned and walked back toward his house, calling over his shoulder that I should not return. I confess I felt relief as I departed. There was something profoundly unsettling about the man and his property. This isolation intensified after 1885, when the Hightower children reached adulthood. County records show no marriages registered for any of the 4 Hightower offspring, no applications for business licenses, no property purchases separate from the family farm, no military service records despite the Spanish-American War beginning in 1898. It was as if the children never left the property at all. The few townspeople who had dealings with the Hightowers during the 1890s left fragmentary accounts. Samuel Morrison, who operated the general store in Bucyrus, kept a journal that survives today in the possession of his great-granddaughter. An entry from April 1896 reads, "The Hightowers came to town today, all 6 of them moving together like a single organism. They purchased flour, salt, lamp oil, and an unusual quantity of medicinal supplies, including laudanum and carbolic acid. The women, both mother and daughters, wore dresses of identical dark fabric, high-necked and long-sleeved, despite the warmth of the day. The daughters appeared pale, almost sickly. When I inquired after their health, the father simply stared at me until I turned away. They paid in coins, some quite old, and departed without further conversation." The architecture of the Hightower Barn itself deserves examination. Built in 1875, the structure measured 60 feet in length and 40 feet in width, with walls constructed of oak timber a full 8 inches thick. This was unusual. Most barns of the period used 4-inch timbers. The barn's windows were positioned 12 feet above ground level, far higher than necessary for ventilation. The main doors were reinforced with iron brackets and featured multiple locks. A carpenter named Otto Brennan, who had helped with repairs to a neighboring farm in 1894, later told authorities that he had attempted to assist the Hightowers with what appeared to be structural damage to their barn's roof. Ezekiel Hightower had declined the help, stating that family matters are handled within the family. Brennan noted something else. He claimed that while standing near the barn, he heard what sounded like a child crying from beneath his feet, as if the sound was coming from underground. When he mentioned this to Ezekiel, the man's face had turned to stone. Brennan was escorted off the property immediately. By 1897, the Hightower farm had become something of a local legend. Parents in Bucyrus used it as a cautionary tale, warning children not to wander too close to the Hightower woods. Hunters avoided the area, claiming the forest around the property felt wrong, oppressive. Several reported finding crude wooden crosses nailed to trees marking the boundary of Hightower land, each inscribed with biblical verses about purity and bloodlines. The county sheriff in 1897 was a man named Robert Thaddeus Cole, a former Union cavalry officer who had settled in Bucyrus after the Civil War. Sheriff Cole's official records, preserved in the Crawford County courthouse, paint a picture of a lawman frustrated by the limitations of his jurisdiction. Several entries from 1896 and early 1897 mention complaints about the Hightowers, sounds heard at night, concerns from neighbors, but each entry ends with a variation of no evidence of criminal activity, unable to obtain warrant for search. This was the context into which Dr. Howard Pierce rode on that November morning in 1897. A respected physician entering a property that had become synonymous with dark rumors and unsettling secrets. A man of science and reason confronting something that would challenge everything he understood about human nature and family bonds. The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to haunt us now, is simple. What was really happening inside that barn? What kind of births required such secrecy? And why did those in the Hightower family never leave? Dr. Howard Pierce departed his home at 412 Walnut Street in Bucyrus at approximately 3:15 in the morning on November 17, 1897. This precise timing is known because his wife, Eleanor Pierce, noted it in her personal diary, a document that would later become crucial evidence. She wrote, "Howard received a summons from the Hightower farm. A complicated birth, they claim. He seemed troubled by the request, but stated his duty as a physician compels him to help any who ask. He promised to return by supper. I watched him ride into the darkness and felt a chill I cannot explain." The rider who delivered the summons was never identified. Eleanor Pierce described him as young, perhaps 20 years old, wearing dark clothing and speaking very little. He handed Dr. Pierce a sealed envelope containing a handwritten note and a substantial payment in gold coins, enough to cover a week's worth of house calls. The note itself was preserved and read simply, "Dr. Pierce, your services are required immediately for a birth of complicated nature. Discretion is essential. Come alone. The Hightower family." Dr. Pierce was a meticulous man. His medical journals, discovered after his disappearance, contain detailed accounts of every patient visit, every diagnosis, every treatment prescribed. The entry for November 16th, the day before his departure, ends with, "Received unusual summons to Hightower Farm. Have heard troubling rumors about this family for years. Will investigate and provide medical assistance as needed. If complications arise, we'll send word for additional help." No such word ever came. By November 20th, 3 full days after Dr. Pierce's departure, Eleanor Pierce contacted Sheriff Robert Cole. Her husband had never failed to return when promised, had never gone 3 days without communication. Sheriff Cole, already suspicious of the Hightower family due to years of strange reports, assembled a search party of 6 men, including Deputy Thomas Warren, Town Constable James Mitchell, and 4 armed volunteers. The search party departed Bucyrus on the morning of November 20th, equipped with rifles, lanterns, and legal documentation authorizing them to investigate the disappearance of a county citizen. The ride to the Hightower property took nearly 3 hours along muddy forest roads. Deputy Warren's official report, filed later that day, describes their arrival. "We approached the Hightower farm at approximately 11:02 a.m. The property appeared abandoned. No smoke rose from the chimneys of the main house, no animals visible in the yard or fields. The red barn stood silent, its doors closed. An oppressive quiet hung over everything. Several men in our party expressed reluctance to proceed. I confess I felt it too. A wrongness in the very air." Sheriff Cole called out, identifying himself and stating his purpose. No response came from the house. The party approached cautiously, weapons drawn. The main house, a 2-story structure of weathered wood, stood with all its curtains drawn. Sheriff Cole knocked repeatedly on the front door. Silence. He tried the handle. Unlocked. The door swung open with a prolonged creak. What they found inside the house was the first indication that something was profoundly wrong. The interior was abandoned, but recently so. A pot of stew sat on the stove, cold but not yet spoiled. Dishes were washed and stacked. Beds were made with military precision, but the family was gone. All 6 members of the Hightower household had vanished, leaving behind their furniture, their clothing, even family photographs on the walls. But it was in the kitchen that the search party found the first truly disturbing evidence. On the table lay Dr. Pierce's medical bag, its contents scattered as if examined and discarded. His instruments were there, his bottles of medication, his notebooks. But Dr. Pierce himself was nowhere to be found. Beside the bag sat a leather-bound journal that would later be identified as belonging to Ezekiel Hightower. Deputy Warren recorded the discovery. "We found a journal written in a hand both educated and deeply troubled. The entries span years, beginning in 1875. The content is disturbing in the extreme. References to maintaining bloodline purity through careful breeding. Detailed genealogical charts showing unions between family members across multiple generations. Biblical justifications for what can only be described as systematic incest. One entry, dated November 16, 1897, reads, "The doctor has been summoned. Elizabeth's child comes early. If he interferes, if he speaks of what he sees, measures must be taken. The family bloodline cannot be compromised by outside judgment. We have done what is necessary for 22 years. We will not be stopped now." The search party proceeded to the barn. The massive red structure loomed before them, its high windows, revealing nothing of what lay within. Sheriff Cole ordered the main doors opened. 2 men pulled on the handles. The doors were locked from the inside. Constable Mitchell and another volunteer circled the building, searching for another entrance. They found a smaller door on the eastern side, also locked but less substantially built. Using a sledgehammer from the main house, they broke through. The interior of the barn was unlike anything a typical rural farm would contain. The main floor was divided into sections by hanging curtains and wooden partitions. Several areas appeared to be living quarters, equipped with beds, chairs, and personal belongings. But the livestock area, where one would expect to find stalls for horses or cattle, had been converted into something entirely different. Small rooms, each approximately 8 feet by 8 feet, lined the southern wall. 6 rooms in total. Each contained a single bed, a chamber pot, and restraints bolted to the walls. Deputy Warren's voice shook when he later described what they found in one of these rooms. A woman's dress, torn and stained with blood. Children's clothing, far too many articles for a single child. Toys carved from wood, crude but clearly made with care. And on the wall, scratched into the wood with what must have been a nail or piece of metal, a single word repeated over and over: help. But the most significant discovery came when one of the volunteers noticed that the barn floor in the northwest corner sounded hollow when stepped upon. They pried up the floorboards to reveal a staircase descending into darkness. Sheriff Cole lit a lantern and led the way down. Beneath the barn was a network of underground rooms, roughly excavated from the earth and reinforced with timber. The smell that rose from below was overwhelming: human waste, decay, and something else. Something sweet and sickly that none of the men could identify, but all recognized instinctively as the smell of death. The first underground chamber contained shelves lined with jars. The lantern light revealed their contents: preserved specimens, biological samples, and documents. Medical records detailing births, dates, parentage listed in clinical detail that revealed the full scope of what had been happening on the Hightower farm. 22 births in the past 15 years, each child born from unions between immediate family members: father and daughter, brother and sister, mother and son. The records indicated that only 11 of these children had survived past infancy. And there, in the second underground chamber, they found Dr. Howard Pierce. The physician was alive but unconscious, bound to a chair with rope, a cloth gag in his mouth. He had been badly beaten. His medical knowledge had apparently been extracted under duress, and then he had been left to die in the darkness beneath the barn. Dr. Pierce was carried from the underground chambers and revived. When he regained consciousness, he spoke only 3 words before falling silent again. "They're all gone." It would be weeks before he could provide a complete account of what he had witnessed in the Hightower barn, and even then there were things he claimed he could not speak of, horrors too profound to put into words. The search party spent the remainder of that day documenting what they found. Room after room revealed evidence of a systematic program of inbreeding spanning decades. But the Hightower family themselves had disappeared completely. No tracks led away from the property. No neighbors reported seeing them pass. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Before we continue to the most disturbing discoveries made in the following days, I want to pause and hear from you. Based on what you've learned so far, what do you think was really happening in that barn? Where did the Hightower family go? And most importantly, what happened to those 11 children who survived? Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Your theories matter, because as we'll see in the next part of this investigation, the truth is far more complex and disturbing than anyone in 1897 could have imagined. In the days following the discovery at the Hightower farm, Sheriff Cole organized a comprehensive investigation of the property. What had begun as a search for a missing physician had evolved into something far more sinister. The unraveling of a multi-generational conspiracy of abuse hidden beneath the veneer of religious devotion and family privacy. The investigation team expanded to include County Prosecutor Abraham Winters, 2 additional physicians from nearby Marion County, and a photographer hired to document evidence. The photographic plates created during this investigation still exist in the Crawford County Historical Society archives, though they are not available for public viewing due to their disturbing nature. The most revealing evidence came from the documents discovered throughout the property. Ezekiel Hightower had been a meticulous record keeper, maintaining detailed journals that chronicled not just farm activities, but the systematic program of inbreeding that had defined the family for decades. The earliest journal discovered dated to 1873, the year Ezekiel inherited the property from his father. The first entry, written in a careful, educated hand, read, "Father has passed. Before his death, he revealed to me the true purpose of our family's isolation. We are not merely farmers. We are guardians of purity. For 3 generations, the Hightower bloodline has been carefully maintained, kept free from the contamination of outside influence." Father showed me the genealogical records, every union carefully planned, every child a step toward perfection. He showed me what our bloodline has produced: intelligence, strength, longevity. But he also showed me the cost. Not all children survive. Not all are born whole. This is the burden we carry, the price of purity. Subsequent entries detailed Ezekiel's own participation in this program. His marriage to Margaret Thornton in 1868 had not been the beginning, but rather a continuation. Margaret herself was a second cousin, carefully selected for her Hightower ancestry. The children born of their union, Thomas, Elizabeth, Samuel, and Rebecca, were described in the journals not as beloved offspring, but as vessels of the purified bloodline. The journals revealed that when the children reached maturity, they were not permitted to leave the farm or marry outside the family. Instead, they were expected to participate in the continuation of the bloodline through unions with each other and with their parents. The language Ezekiel used was clinical, detached, framing these acts as religious duty rather than crime. He quoted extensively from distorted interpretations of Old Testament passages about the purity of bloodlines, about keeping oneself separate from the corrupting influence of outsiders. One particularly chilling entry from 1887 read, "Thomas came to me with concerns about Elizabeth. He does not wish to perform his duty. I reminded him of Father's teachings, of the sacrifices made by previous generations. The bloodline must continue. I showed him the photographs of our ancestors, the strength evident in their features, the intelligence in their eyes. He reluctantly agreed. Elizabeth is ready. The first child of the new generation will arrive by spring." But the journals also revealed the terrible cost of this obsession. Of the 22 children born between 1875 and 1897, 11 had died in infancy or early childhood. The causes varied: congenital defects, stillbirth, failure to thrive, unexplained seizures. Ezekiel recorded each death with the same clinical detachment, noting physical abnormalities and speculating about genetic factors. There was no grief in these entries, no acknowledgement of suffering, only data, only the cold calculation of which bloodlines produced the strongest offspring and which combinations should be avoided in future breeding. The journals mentioned the barn's underground chambers directly. They had been excavated in 1875, shortly after the barn's construction, specifically to house the pregnant women away from any possibility of outside observation. The chambers also served another purpose: isolating children born with severe defects, keeping them hidden from the world until they died. Ezekiel wrote about this without apparent moral conflict, as if he were describing the culling of livestock rather than the treatment of human children. On November 23, 1897, 3 days after the initial discovery, the investigation team began a systematic excavation of the property. They started with the underground chambers beneath the barn, but it quickly became apparent that these rooms were not the only secrets buried on the Hightower farm. Dr. Samuel Coopersmith, one of the physicians brought in from Marion County, noticed something disturbing about the soil in one of the underground chambers. The floor was uneven, showing signs of repeated digging and refilling. When Sheriff Cole ordered the floor excavated, they made a discovery that shocked even these men who thought they had seen the worst the Hightower property had to offer. 18 inches below the surface, wrapped in burlap and quicklime, they found the first body. An infant, no more than a few months old, showing severe physical deformities. The skeletal remains indicated multiple congenital abnormalities: malformed skull, fused vertebrae, shortened limbs. Dr. Coopersmith's official report stated, "This child could not have survived more than a few weeks outside the womb. The defects are consistent with genetic abnormalities resulting from close relation breeding. Death would have been a mercy." But that was only the first. Over the following week, excavations revealed 9 more burial sites beneath the barn. Some contained multiple remains. In total, they recovered the bodies of 14 children, ranging in age from newborn to approximately 5 years old. Each showed varying degrees of physical abnormality. Each had been buried in the same manner, wrapped in burlap, covered in quicklime to accelerate decomposition, and interred in shallow graves beneath the place where they had been born. The documentation of these discoveries was handled with unusual care. County Prosecutor Winters understood that what they were uncovering was unprecedented in Ohio legal history. Every body was photographed in situ before removal. Every artifact was catalogued. Every measurement was recorded. The resulting documentation filled 3 large volumes that remain sealed in the Crawford County courthouse to this day. But the horror extended beyond the barn itself. A search of the surrounding property revealed 3 additional burial sites in the woods, approximately 200 yards from the main house. These graves were older, dating back decades based on the decomposition of the remains and the growth of trees whose roots had grown through the burial sites. These were the failures of previous generations, the products of the Hightower family's obsession with bloodline purity, stretching back to Ezekiel's father and grandfather. A local minister, Reverend Philip Hutchins, was called to the property to provide last rites for the remains before they were removed for proper burial. His diary entry from that day survives. "I have served God for 35 years. I have presided over the funerals of children taken by disease, accident, and misfortune. But nothing prepared me for what I witnessed at the Hightower farm. These children were not victims of fate. They were the products of deliberate evil, conceived in sin and born into suffering, their short lives and deaths hidden from the grace of God and the protection of law. I performed the rites, but I confess my faith was shaken. What kind of world allows such horror to persist for generations, hidden in plain sight?" Among the most disturbing evidence discovered at the Hightower farm were the photographs. In an era when photography was expensive and typically reserved for formal occasions, the Hightowers had amassed a collection of over 100 photographic plates documenting their program of selective breeding. These photographs were found in a locked iron box hidden beneath the floorboards of Ezekiel and Margaret's bedroom. The box also contained genealogical charts drawn with meticulous precision, medical instruments of unusual design, and a leather-bound Bible with extensive annotations in the margins. The photographs themselves were organized chronologically, beginning in 1875. The earliest images showed formal family portraits, Ezekiel and Margaret with their young children appearing like any other farming family of the era. But later photographs revealed the true nature of the Hightower household, images of pregnant women in various stages of gestation, their faces expressionless, their eyes vacant. Photographs of newborn infants being measured and examined, clinical documentation rather than loving family portraits. Pictures of children at various ages, often showing physical abnormalities, each labeled with dates and notations about parentage. One series of photographs, dated 1889 to 1894, showed the same girl from infancy to approximately 5 years of age. The notations on the back identified her as Subject 7, Mother, Elizabeth Father Thomas. The child showed progressive physical deterioration across the sequence of images. The final photograph in the series was dated March 1894, showing a severely malnourished child with obvious developmental abnormalities. There were no subsequent photographs of this child. A cross-reference to Ezekiel's journals indicated that Subject 7 had died in April 1894 and been buried in the underground chamber. The genealogical charts found in the box revealed the full scope of the Hightower program. 3 generations of careful inbreeding, with unions planned and executed with the precision of agricultural breeding. The charts used a complex system of symbols to denote relationships, outcomes, and genetic traits. Circles indicated females, squares indicated males, lines connected parents to offspring, and special marks indicated children who survived past infancy versus those who did not. What made these charts particularly disturbing was their clinical language. Children were referred to by number rather than name. Genetic traits were catalogued: eye color, hair color, height, intelligence markers, physical abnormalities. It was the language of animal husbandry applied to human beings, the reduction of children to data points in a grotesque experiment. The annotated Bible provided perhaps the most insight into Ezekiel's mindset. Passages about purity, about keeping oneself separate from corruption, about the chosen people, maintaining their bloodlines, were underlined and annotated with extensive margin notes. Ezekiel had constructed an entire theological framework to justify his actions, cherry-picking scriptural passages and interpreting them through a lens of genetic superiority and bloodline preservation. One margin note, written beside Leviticus 18, which explicitly forbids incestuous unions, read, "These prohibitions apply to the common people, those whose bloodlines are already corrupted. We are different. We are the pure strain, the original creation. For us, the maintenance of purity supersedes these common laws. We follow a higher mandate." When Dr. Howard Pierce finally recovered sufficiently to provide a complete account of his experience, his testimony filled in the remaining gaps in the investigation. The physician had been severely traumatized by what he witnessed, and his health never fully recovered. He died in 1903 at the age of 52, having never fully resumed his medical practice. His official statement, given to County Prosecutor Winters on December 1, 1897, was transcribed and filed as evidence. Dr. Pierce described arriving at the Hightower farm in the early morning hours of November 17th. He was met at the main house by Ezekiel Hightower and led immediately to the barn. Inside, he found Elizabeth Hightower in active labor, attended by her mother Margaret and sister Rebecca. The conditions were appalling. Elizabeth was restrained to a bed in one of the small rooms, her wrists and ankles bound. Dr. Pierce initially believed this was to prevent her from injuring herself during labor, a common practice for difficult births. Only later would he understand the true purpose of the restraints. The birth itself was complicated by severe fetal abnormalities. Dr. Pierce worked for several hours to deliver the child, a process made more difficult by Elizabeth's obvious terror and Margaret's insistence that he work quickly and quietly. When the infant was finally delivered, it was immediately apparent that it would not survive. The child showed severe neural tube defects, missing portions of the skull and brain. It died within minutes of birth. Dr. Pierce's training and ethics demanded that he remain to care for the mother, but it was at this point that the situation turned dangerous. When he attempted to comfort Elizabeth, to assure her that she would recover despite the loss of the child, she grabbed his hand and whispered, "Please, help us. He'll make me do it again. He always makes us do it again." Before Dr. Pierce could respond, Ezekiel entered the room. He had overheard Elizabeth's plea. What followed was a confrontation that revealed the full horror of the Hightower system. Ezekiel explained in chilling detail the family's program of selective breeding. He spoke as if lecturing a student, explaining the genetic theories that guided his breeding program, the careful selection of which family members would produce offspring with which others. When Dr. Pierce expressed shock and horror, when he stated his intention to report what he had witnessed to authorities, Ezekiel's demeanor changed entirely. The clinical detachment vanished, replaced by cold rage. Dr. Pierce was overpowered by Thomas and Samuel Hightower, who'd been waiting outside the room. He was beaten severely, his medical bag confiscated, and dragged to the underground chambers where he was bound and left in darkness. Dr. Pierce estimated he was held captive for approximately 60 hours. During that time, he heard movement above him, voices speaking in urgent tones, the sounds of hasty packing. When the sheriff's party finally found him on November 20th, the Hightower family had already fled. Their departure had apparently been planned quickly, but executed efficiently. They had taken clothing, food, money, and most importantly, the surviving children. The question that haunted Dr. Pierce for the rest of his life was the same one that would haunt the investigation. Where had they gone, and what would happen to those children, those products of generational incest, now hidden somewhere beyond the reach of law? The Hightower case dominated headlines throughout Ohio in late 1897 and early 1898. Wanted posters were distributed across multiple states. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired by Crawford County to assist in the search. Rewards were offered for information leading to the capture of the Hightower family. Despite these efforts, no credible sightings were ever confirmed. The family had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. By 1900, the investigation had gone cold. The Hightower property was seized by the county for unpaid taxes and eventually sold at auction in 1903. The barn was torn down in 1905 by the new owners, who filled in the underground chambers with earth and planted crops over the site. The main house stood empty for years before being demolished in 1912. For decades, the Hightower case faded from public memory, becoming local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in Crawford County but largely forgotten by the outside world. Then, in 1952, construction workers breaking ground for a new state highway that would pass near the former Hightower property made an unexpected discovery. Approximately half a mile from the original farmhouse, deep in what had been the Hightower forest, they uncovered the entrance to a previously unknown underground structure. The discovery was reported to local authorities, and an archaeological team from Ohio State University was called to investigate. What they found was a tunnel system far more extensive than the chambers beneath the barn. These tunnels appeared to be decades old, possibly dating to the mid-1800s, suggesting that the Hightower program of concealment extended back even further than previously believed. Dr. Margaret Ashworth, the lead archaeologist on the 1952 investigation, documented her findings in a report that was eventually published in the Journal of Ohio History in 1955. She wrote, "The tunnel system suggests a long-term, multi-generational program of concealment. We found evidence of habitation, makeshift beds, cooking areas, stored provisions. More disturbing were the carved marks on the tunnel walls, hundreds of them appearing to be tally marks or some form of record-keeping. We also discovered 3 additional burial sites within the tunnel system containing remains that predate the 1897 investigation by at least 2 decades. Among the artifacts recovered from the tunnels was a partially destroyed diary, severely damaged by moisture and time. Only fragments were legible, but what could be read provided chilling additional context. The diary appeared to belong to Ezekiel Hightower's father, the man who had first revealed the family's true purpose to Ezekiel before his death in 1873. One legible passage dated 1868 read, "The boy is ready now. I have prepared him as my father, prepared me. He understands the importance of our work. Tonight I showed him the deep tunnels, the places where the failures are kept until they pass. He wept, but he will strengthen. They all do. This is our burden. This is our sacred duty. The bloodline must remain pure, no matter the cost." The discovery of these tunnels sparked renewed interest in the Hightower case. In 1956, a graduate student at Ohio State University named Robert Harrison wrote his thesis on the Hightower family, conducting interviews with surviving residents of Crawford County who remembered the original investigation. Harrison's research uncovered several significant pieces of information that had not been widely known. One interview was with Clara Whitmore, who in 1956 was 83 years old and had lived her entire life in Crawford County. Clara claimed that her grandmother had worked briefly as a domestic servant for the Hightower family in the 1860s, before the strict isolation began. According to Clara's account, her grandmother had witnessed disturbing things even then: children who were never seen outside the house, strange nocturnal activities, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear that eventually drove her to quit her position. Clara's grandmother had left behind a letter written in 1895, 2 years before the scandal broke. The letter, preserved by the family and shared with Harrison, contained a passage that seemed almost prophetic. "I have never forgotten my time at the Hightower farm. I have carried the burden of what I witnessed for decades, afraid to speak for fear of being called mad. But I know what I saw. I know those children were prisoners. I know the sounds I heard at night were not animals, but humans suffering. Someday, the truth will emerge. Someday, someone will have the courage to look into that cursed place and expose the evil that festers there." Harrison's thesis also documented a strange pattern of purchases made through various general stores in neighboring counties during the 1880s and 1890s. By cross-referencing merchant records that had been preserved in various historical societies, Harrison discovered that someone had been regularly purchasing large quantities of certain items: medical supplies, preserved foods, children's clothing in various sizes, and educational materials including primers and basic textbooks. The purchases were always made with cash by different individuals, but the pattern suggested a hidden population being supplied and maintained. Most intriguingly, these purchases continued after 1897. Records from a general store in Mansfield, Ohio, approximately 30 miles from the Hightower farm, showed similar purchases occurring regularly until at least 1915. Harrison theorized that the Hightower family, or some remnant of it, had survived and relocated, continuing their program in a new location. In 1978, a construction crew renovating a long-abandoned farmhouse in Ashland County, Ohio, made another disturbing discovery. Hidden behind a false wall in the cellar, they found a metal box containing photographs and documents. The photographs showed individuals who bore striking resemblance to the Hightowers, but taken decades after 1897. The documents included birth records for children born between 1898 and 1912, listing parents with the surnames Hightower, Thornton, and several other names that appeared in the original Hightower genealogies. The discovery was reported to Ohio State Police, who conducted an investigation. DNA analysis, still a relatively new forensic tool in 1978, confirmed that the individuals in the photographs shared genetic markers consistent with the Hightower bloodline. But attempts to trace these individuals led nowhere. The names on the documents proved to be aliases or dead ends. The trail, once again, went cold. A local historian named Patricia Drummond spent 5 years researching this discovery. Her book, published in 1984 and titled The Hightower Legacy, America's Hidden Horror, compiled all known information about the case and its aftermath. Drummond proposed a disturbing theory that the Hightower program had not ended in 1897, but had merely adapted. The family had learned to be more careful, more hidden, maintaining their isolation while avoiding the attention that had nearly destroyed them. Drummond's research uncovered one final piece of evidence that lent credence to her theory. In 1923, a physician in Columbus, Ohio, had treated a young woman for complications from childbirth. The woman gave a false name and disappeared from the hospital before doctors could question her further. But the physician, Dr. William Morse, noted in his private files that the woman's child showed genetic abnormalities consistent with close relation breeding, and that the woman herself bore a striking resemblance to photographs he had seen of the Hightower women. Dr. Morse's notes, discovered after his death in 1967, included a chilling observation. "I asked the woman about the father of her child. She looked at me with empty eyes and said only, 'We keep the bloodline pure. It is our burden and our glory.' Then she took her child and fled." I have never forgotten those words or the hopelessness in her voice. These fragments, scattered across decades, paint a picture of a horror that may never have truly ended. Did the Hightower family establish a new hidden community somewhere in rural Ohio or beyond? Did they continue their program of selective inbreeding, learning from their mistakes, becoming even more careful to avoid detection? Or did the line finally end, the genetic damage accumulated over generations finally rendering reproduction impossible? The truth remains unknown. But every few years, a new piece of evidence surfaces. A photograph found in an estate sale, a diary discovered in an attic, a deathbed confession from someone who claims to have encountered descendants of the Hightowers. Each fragment adds to the story but never completes it. The Hightower mystery remains open, a wound in Ohio's history that has never fully healed. So what really happened to the Hightower family? After more than a century of investigation, speculation, and occasional new discoveries, we still have no definitive answer. What we have instead are theories, each as disturbing as the last, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none proven beyond doubt. The first theory, and perhaps the most optimistic, is that the family simply scattered after fleeing the farm in November 1897. According to this interpretation, the Hightowers split up, assumed new identities, and attempted to reintegrate into society. The surviving children, having known nothing but isolation and abuse, may have struggled to adapt, but ultimately found their way to normal lives. In this version of events, the program ended with the exposure of the farm, the cycle of generational trauma finally broken by the intervention of law and public scrutiny. This theory is supported by the lack of confirmed sightings and the difficulty authorities had in tracking the family. Perhaps they were simply better at hiding than investigators were at finding. Perhaps mercy, in the end, prevailed, and those children grew into adults who built lives far from the shadow of the Hightower Barn. But there is a second theory, darker and more compelling given the evidence. This theory suggests that the Hightowers never truly disappeared at all. Instead, they went deeper underground, learning from their mistakes, becoming more careful, more isolated. The purchases documented in the decades following 1897, the photographs discovered in 1978, the physician's encounter in 1923, all suggest a continuation rather than an ending. In this interpretation, the Hightower program adapted and survived. Perhaps they established a new isolated compound in a more remote location. Perhaps they learned to interact with society more strategically, maintaining a facade of normalcy while continuing their obsession with bloodline purity in secret. The genetic damage accumulated over generations would have created a ticking clock, but with each generation, they might have modified their approach, introducing careful outside genetic material while maintaining their core ideology. This theory is supported by the pattern of evidence that continues to surface decades after the original scandal. If the family had truly disbanded, if the program had truly ended, why would fragments continue to appear throughout the 20th century? Why would researchers continue to find photographs, documents, and accounts that suggest the Hightower bloodline persisted? There is a third theory, perhaps the most chilling of all. Some researchers, including Patricia Drummond in her 1984 book, have suggested that the Hightower family was not unique, that what happened on that farm in Crawford County was not an isolated incident, but rather an example of a broader phenomenon. Throughout rural America in the 19th and early 20th centuries, isolated communities maintained practices that would horrify modern society. The Hightower case was simply the one that was discovered and documented. If this theory is correct, then the Hightower story is not about one family's descent into horror, but about the dark spaces that exist in any society, the places where oversight fails and where human cruelty can flourish unseen. It suggests that there may have been other families, other farms, other barns hiding similar secrets. Most were never discovered, most remain hidden still. To this day, no one knows the truth. The Hightower family has never been found. No bodies matching their descriptions were ever identified in morgues or cemeteries. No descendants have come forward claiming Hightower ancestry. The 11 children who survived and fled with the family in 1897 vanished completely from historical record. They would be long dead now, even if they lived to extreme old age. But their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, if they exist, could be anywhere. The Hightower property itself has been completely transformed. The highway built in the 1950s cut through part of the original farmland. A shopping center now occupies the area where the barn once stood. Thousands of people drive past that location every day, unaware of the horror that transpired there more than a century ago. Only a small historical marker, installed in 2005, acknowledges what happened. Site of the Hightower Farm, 1831-1897. Location of criminal investigation into family isolation and abuse. 14 victims identified and given proper burial, 1897. The marker tells the minimum truth. It does not mention the inbreeding, the underground chambers, the systematic program that spanned generations. It does not mention the children who survived and disappeared. It does not mention that the full story may never be known. I want to thank you for joining me on this dark journey through one of America's most disturbing family secrets. If you found this investigation compelling, if you want to see more cases like this uncovered and examined, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We're building a community of people who aren't afraid to look into the darkest corners of history, who understand that the truth, however horrifying, must be remembered. What do you think happened to the Hightower family? Do you believe they scattered and disappeared, Or do you think they continued their program in hiding? Have you ever heard stories from your own region about isolated families with dark secrets? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your insights matter. Your theories contribute to our collective understanding of these hidden horrors. Join our haunted community. Together, we remember the victims. Together, we seek the truth. And together, we ensure that stories like the Hightower case are never forgotten. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, history's darkest secrets are often hidden in the places we least expect to look. I'll see you in the next investigation.